Chapter 4 of the Elusive Pimpernel by Baroness Orsay, read for LibriVox.org by Karen Savage in December 2007. Chapter 4. The Richmond Gala. It was perhaps the most brilliant September ever known in England, where the last days of dying summer are nearly always golden and beautiful. Strange that in this country, where that same season is so peculiarly radiant with a glory all its own, there should be no special expression in the language with which to accurately name it. So we needs must call it fin d'été, the ending of the summer, not the absolute end, nor yet the ultimate departure, but the tender lingering of a friend obliged to leave us anon, yet who fain would steal a day here and there, a week or so in which to stay with us, who would make that last pathetic farewell of his endure a little while longer still, and bring forth in gorgeous array for our final gaze all that he has which is most luxuriant, most desirable, most worthy of regret. And in this year of grace 1793, departing summer had lavished the treasures of her palette upon woodland and river banks, had tinged the once crude green of larch and elm with a tender hue of gold, had brushed the oaks with tones of warm russet, and put patches of sienna and crimson on the beach. In the gardens the roses were still in bloom, not the delicate blush or lemon ones of June, nor yet the pale banksias and climbers, but the full-blooded red roses of late summer, and deep-coloured apricot ones, with crinkled outside leaves faintly kissed by the frosty dew. In sheltered spots the purple clematis still lingered, whilst the dahlias, brilliant of hue, seemed overbearing in their gorgeous insolence, flaunting their crudely coloured petals against sober backgrounds of mellow leaves, or the dull mossy tones of ancient encircling walls. The gala had always been held about the end of September. The weather on the riverside was most dependable then, and there was always sufficient sunshine as an excuse for bringing out Madam's last new muslin gown, or her pale-coloured quilted petticoat. Then the ground was dry and hard, good alike for walking and for setting up tents and booths, and of these there was of a truth a most goodly array this year. Mountebanks and jugglers from every corner of the world, so it seemed, for there was a man with a face as black as my lord's tricorn, and another with such flat yellow cheeks as made one think of batter pudding and spring aconite, of eggs and other very yellow things. There was a tent wherein dogs, all sorts of dogs, big, little, black, white or tan, did things which no Christian with respect for his own backbone would have dared to perform, and another where a weird-faced old man made beanstalks and walking-sticks, coins of the realm and lace kerchiefs, vanish into thin air. And as it was nice and hot, one could sit out upon the green and listen to the strains of the band, which discoursed sweet music, and watch the young people tread a measure on the sward. The quality had not yet arrived, for humbler folk had partaken of very early dinner so as to get plenty of fun, and long hours of delight for the sixpenny toll demanded at the gates. There was so much to see and so much to do, games of bowls on the green, and a beautiful Aunt Sally, there was a skittle alley, and 2 merry-go-rounds, there were performing monkeys and dancing bears, a woman so fat that 3 men with arms outstretched could not get round her, and a man so thin that he could put a lady's bracelet round his neck and her garter round his waist. There were some funny little dwarfs with pinched faces and a knowing manner, and a giant come all the way from Russia, so 'twas said. The mechanical toys too were a great attraction. You dropped a penny into a little slit in a box, and a doll would begin to dance and play the fiddle. And there was the magic mill, where, for another modest copper, a row of tiny figures, wrinkled and old and dressed in the shabbiest of rags, marched in weary procession up a flight of steps into the mill, only to emerge again the next moment at a further door of this wonderful building, looking young and gay, dressed in gorgeous finery and tripping a dance measure as they descended some steps and were finally lost to view. But what was most wonderful of all, and collected the goodliest crowd of gazers and the largest amount of coins, was a miniature representation of what was going on in France, even at this very moment. And you could not help but be convinced of the truth of it all, so cleverly was it done. There was a background of houses, and a very red-looking sky. Too red, some people said, but were immediately quashed by the dictum of the wise, that the sky represented a sunset, as anyone who looked could see. Then there were a number of little figures no taller than your hand, but with little wooden faces and arms and legs, just beautifully made little dolls, and these were dressed in kirtles and breeches, all rags mostly, and little coats and wooden shoes. They were massed together in groups with their arms all turned upwards. And in the centre of this little stage, on an elevated platform, there were miniature wooden posts close together, and with a long flat board at right angles at the foot of the posts, and all painted a bright red. At the further end of the boards was a miniature basket, and between the two posts at the top was a miniature knife which ran up and down in a groove, and was drawn by a miniature pulley. Folk who knew said that this was a model of a guillotine. And lo and behold, when you dropped a penny into a slot just below the wooden stage, the crowd of little figures started waving their arms up and down, and another little doll would ascend the elevated platform and lie down on the red board at the foot of the wooden posts. Then a figure dressed in brilliant scarlet put out an arm, presumably to touch the pulley, and the tiny knife would rattle down onto the poor little reclining doll's neck, and its head would roll off into the basket beyond. Then there was a loud whir of wheels, a buzz of internal mechanism, and all the little figures would stop dead with arms outstretched, whilst the beheaded doll rolled off the board and was lost to view, no doubt preparatory to going through the same gruesome pantomime again. It was very thrilling and very terrible. A certain air of hushed awe reigned in the booth where this mechanical wonder was displayed. The booth itself stood in a secluded portion of the grounds, far from the toll gates and the bandstand and the noise of the merry-go-round, and there were great texts written in red letters on a black ground pinned all along the walls. "Please spare a copper for the starving poor of Paris." A lady dressed in grey quilted petticoat and pretty grey and black striped panniers could be seen walking in the booth from time to time, then disappearing through a partition beyond. She would emerge again presently carrying an embroidered reticule, and would wander round among the crowd, holding out the bag by its chain, and repeating in tones of somewhat monotonous appeal, "For the starving poor of Paris, if you please." She had fine dark eyes, rather narrow and tending upwards at the outer corners, which gave her face a not altogether pleasant expression. Still they were fine eyes, and when she went round soliciting alms, most of the men put a hand into their breeches pocket and dropped a coin into her embroidered reticule. She said the word poor in a rather funny way, rolling the R at the end, and she also said please as if it was spelt with a long line of E's, and so it was concluded that she was French and was begging for her poorer sisters. At stated intervals during the day, the mechanical toy was rolled into a corner, and the lady in grey stood up on a platform and sang queer little songs, the words of which nobody could understand. Il était une bergère, héron et petit pataplon. But it all left an impression of sadness and of suppressed awe upon the minds and susceptibilities of the worthy Richmond yokels come with their wives or sweethearts to enjoy the fun of the fair, and gladly did everyone emerge out of that melancholy booth into the sunshine, the brightness and the noise. "Lud, but she do give me the creeps," said Mistress Polly, the pretty barmaid from the Bell Inn down by the river, "and I must say I don't see why we English folk should send our hard-earned pennies to those murdering ruffians over the water. Being starving, so to speak, don't make a murderer a better man if he goes on murdering," she added with undisputable, if ungrammatical logic. "Come, let's look at something more cheerful now." And without waiting for anyone else's assent, she turned towards the more lively portion of the grounds, closely followed by a ruddy-faced, somewhat sheepish-looking youth, who very obviously was her attendant swain. It was getting on for 3 o'clock now, and the quality were beginning to arrive. Lord Anthony Dewhurst was already there, chucking every pretty girl under the chin, to the annoyance of her beau. Ladies were arriving all the time, and the humbler feminine hearts were constantly set a-flutter at sight of rich brocaded gowns, and the new Charlottes, all crinkled velvet and soft marabou, which were so becoming to the pretty faces beneath. There was incessant and loud talking and chattering, with here and there the shriller tones of a French voice being distinctly noticeable in the din. There were a good many French ladies and gentlemen present, easily recognisable even in the distance, for their clothes were of more sober hue and of lesser richness than those of their English compeers. But they were great lords and ladies nevertheless, dukes and duchesses and countesses, come to England for fear of being murdered by those devils in their own country. Richmond was full of them just now, as they were made right welcome both at the palace and at the magnificent home of Sir Percy and Lady Blakeney. Ah! Here comes Sir Andrew Ffoulkes with his lady, so pretty and dainty does she look, like a little china doll in her new-fashioned short-waisted gown, her brown hair in soft waves above her smooth forehead, her great hazel eyes fixed in unaffected admiration on the gallant husband by her side. "No wonder she dotes on him," sighed pretty Mistress Polly after she had bobbed her curtsy to my lady. "The brave deeds he did for love of her! Rescued her from those murderers over in France, and brought her to England safe and sound, having fought no end of them single-handed, or so I've heard it said. Have you not, Master Thomas Jessord?" And she looked defiantly at her meek-looking cavalier. "Bah!" replied Master Thomas with quite unusual vehemence in response to the disparaging look in her brown eyes. "'Tis not he who did it all, as well you know, Mistress Polly. Sir Andrew Ffoulkes is a gallant gentleman, you may take your Bible oath on that, but he that fights the murdering frog-eaters single-handed